Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on funding for downwinders. Joining us now live in studio is Mary Dickson, a downwinder herself and who now advocates for U.S. radioactive fallout victims for her life's work. Mary, thank you so much for being here tonight to share your story and your work.
Thank you, Rosie. I'm glad to be here, believe me.
Mary, you grew up in Salt Lake City, but you suspect that you suffered from fallout from nuclear testing. Can you tell us about what happened to you and your family?
Sure. First, I just want to say, everybody thinks this is something that just happened in southern Utah. It was not. I mean, we've known from studies since the 90s that it spread across the United States. A lot of counties in northern Utah got more fallout than those in southern Utah sometimes. Counties in Idaho and Colorado and Montana also suffered. I grew up in Salt Lake City in the Canyon Rim area, and I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer in my 20s. Thyroid cancer is one of the most common cancers caused by fallout, especially if you were exposed as a young child like I was. My sister and I started keeping a list of everyone this is my sister Ann, of everyone in our childhood neighborhood who got cancer or autoimmune diseases. That list grew to 54 people in a 5-block area. And we always thought, okay, something happened to us. Ironically, I was writing about nuclear testing for a publication called The Desert Sun. We monitored below ground tests that were leaking because testing lasted until 1992. Above ground testing went from 51 to 62, but then they went underground. Many of those leaked, some of them with mushroom clouds as big as above ground test. So I found out what happened to me. I mean, in subsequent years, I have another sister who is suffering from a rare form of cancer, another sister with autoimmune diseases. My sister Ann, who put that list together with me, died when she was only 46 and left 3 children behind. I myself had another surgery later after I had thyroid cancer surgery, and that second surgery meant I could never have children. So we have suffered, we've buried people, we've watched people get sick, people are still getting sick. It's been a pretty hard lot. It can be incredibly depressing, and it's hard work. It's hard work. Anyway, nothing makes you an activist faster than a diagnosis, and because I was a writer and a journalist, I was prepared to write about it. I've written a lot about it. I wrote a play about it, and I continue to watch friends get sick and to lose people. So those losses just keep piling up.
This is really like a hidden killer.
Yes.
With COVID, you know, everything is happening so fast in a short amount of time. But this is something that bears the same amount of brunt, maybe even more, but because it's spread out over so many years,
yes,
people are not paying as much attention to it as they should. Now, there was a secondary coverage of radioactivity. Milk was irradiated and
right,
spread throughout the country. Tell us about that.
Well, okay, what happens is the test in Nevada, and there were 928 tests in Nevada, all more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is a map of everywhere that fallout went. This map is based on government data. They kept maps of where the jet stream carried fallout from every test. This shows that it went across the entire country. Look at Utah, completely covered. It was, again, the spread of this is something most people don't even know about. To this day, when I tell people I'm a downwinder, they say, "Oh, are you from southern Utah? I didn't know you were from southern Utah." So it's been a really frustrating battle to get people to understand the extent and how many people could have been affected. There are estimates that are very high. There was a study just in 2019 that a gentleman from the University of Arizona did. He said that up to 500,000 deaths, largely in the Midwest and the East Coast, were likely due to fallout contaminated agriculture. So you're probably wondering, okay, how does that fallout get to the ground? Well, as it goes across a jet stream, if it collides with a rainstorm, with a snowstorm, it literally falls out. That's why it's called fallout. Makes its way into the food chain, into the milk, even into sometimes the packaging that food is shipped in. As early as 1951, when they started testing, it was found that it was fogging the film in Rochester, New York at Kodak.
That is just so unbelievable.
Yep.
Really why it's called the hidden killer.
Yeah.
Mary, I am so intrigued by your story and what you've been doing, your advocacy work. We have to wrap. We have about 30 seconds left. I do want to get to our last question. What's the main message that you have for our viewers who are watching tonight?
Okay, my main message is you could very well be a downwinder. In America, we're all downwinders. That fallout went everywhere. People are still getting sick. The lag time between exposure and diagnosis, it can take an entire lifetime sometimes for cancer to show up, and it can show up anywhere during your lifetime. So people are still suffering. They're still getting sick. Compensation, we've been fighting to expand compensation for years. Right now, just a section of southern Utah in Utah is covered. We want this new bills that are in the Senate and Congress right now would expand that to include other states and all of Utah and increase the amount. Right now it's $50,000, which doesn't even cover one chemo treatment.
Oh my gosh, that is just mind-blowing. You've been hearing from Mary Dickson, a downwinder who now advocates for U.S. radioactive fallout victims. Mary, thank you so much for being on the show to educate about this. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you.
We now know the real story. We know that the government lied.
That was Representative Jim Matheson back in 2012 talking about nuclear bomb testing. Welcome back to our second In Focus discussion tonight. There are a number of stories about downwinders, but if there is one person with a downwinder story who contributed to national change, it would be our next guest. Joining us now via Zoom is 7-term Congressman Jim Matheson. Representative Matheson, thanks for making time to be a part of our show. It's good to see you.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Now, for those in our audience who may not know, could you tell us about your family's downwinder story?
Well, my family roots are in southern Utah. There are 5 generations of Mathesons buried in the Parowan Cemetery. And the way I got first introduced to this story is when my father was governor, and I came home one day and he was sitting in his office and he had a yellow legal pad in his hand with all these handwritten lists on it. He was going through it saying, that's a cousin, that's an uncle. And I said, what's that? And he says, well, the people down in Iron County, our relatives sent up this list of all the people who died of cancer. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, it's because it's the fallout from the radioactive testing, and we want to make this an issue because we got to get the facts out. Because the federal government had kept all this information classified up to that point. And when he was governor, he helped get the information declassified that showed that the nuclear weapons testing that was done at the Nevada test site was only done when the wind blew the fallout in the least populated direction, and that was southern Utah. And so this is an issue that meant a lot to us in terms of he helped expose the issue. And then, of course, my father died of cancer. He had multiple myeloma, which is a radiation form cause of cancer, and he lived in southern Utah. Right after he graduated from law school, in fact, he lived in Cedar City, and he talked about when the nuclear test would happen, you'd get up and you'd watch the sky light up from the blast in the morning, and how everyone in southern Utah felt it was really their patriotic duty to support this testing. Little did they know they were actually being put at risk.
We are so sorry to hear that your family has been impacted in this way. Now, you were quoted in 2016 talking about the federal government hiding information about the widespread damage of nuclear testing. You said, quote, they lied to people. They said it was safe when they knew it wasn't. There's no doubt about that. Talk about the fight for compensation for those affected in that context. Why was it still extremely hard to get that compensation?
You know, first of all, it was just getting the government to admit the truth. You know, they really did tell everyone it's safe, but as I said, they only did the testing when the wind blew the fall in the least populated direction. In fact, they referred to the people living in southern Utah as a low-use segment of our population. And so they knew it was dangerous. That's why they only did the testing when the wind blew in one direction, and they wouldn't admit it. The reason the compensation issue is so important is not really the money in the compensation, though that can help a lot of families affected by this. But it's really about having the government admit that they were at fault and take responsibility for their actions. That's what's most important about that compensation legislation.
There is bipartisan support to expand and extend compensation for downwinders, but none of our federal delegation has signed on to it yet. Why is this?
Well, I haven't talked to them about it, so I can't speak for them, but I'd like to think that there would continue to be bipartisan support. You know, this issue's always had bipartisan support. When the original Compensation Act passed through Congress in the 1980s, it was Senator Hatch from Utah that was the leader, and he had support from Congressman Owens, who was a Democrat. And so there's always been bipartisan support. This is such an important issue in terms of lesson that we should never forget in the state of Utah. I'd like to think any elected official would want to be on board in expanding this compensation.
Representative Matheson, in your assessment, what are the chances the compensation will be extended and maybe even expanded?
Well, it's always tough to pass legislation these days in Congress, but I'd like to think again, this issue has such meaning in terms of a lesson that should never be forgotten by this country, that in the name of national defense, which is super important, we put our own citizens' lives at risk. And also because people continue to talk about developing new nuclear weapons. And if we're going to develop new weapons, they're going to want to test those weapons. And the only place to test them is in Nevada, and Utah's downwind of that. So this issue may seem like this is something that happened a long time ago. And why do we need to be talking about it today? Because it could happen again. That's why I'd hope that we can get this legislation to pass.
Yeah, well said. Now, there are only a few of the original downwinders left. Are you at all concerned that this issue could be an issue that would be lost with time?
Well, the most compelling voices are the ones who lived through it. So there's no question that as this generation of folks who are exposed in downwind passes on, it removes an important voice in the argument for remembering this issue. That being said, I'd like to think it's a super compelling issue for all of us. I'd like to think we would never forget. It's certainly something I'm going to keep talking about. But you raise a fair question, and that's why I'm really glad that we're talking about it today. It's just important for everyone to know this story, know the history of it, and know the fact that people want to make new nuclear weapons, and it could happen again.
What is one takeaway that you would like to leave our viewers with at the end of this segment?
There is no proven way that you can test nuclear weapons without putting people at risk. And people want to develop new nuclear weapons, so I encourage everyone to keep an eye on this issue in terms of public health and safety, particularly for those in a state that's already paid so dearly for the past actions of the federal government.
All right, you've been hearing from Representative Jim Matheson. Representative, we know this is an issue near and dear to your heart. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us tonight. It was good to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad you're highlighting this story.
When that fallout spread across the United States, no one told us we were at risk. There were no masks that would have protected us. Nothing would have protected us.
No one in Salt Lake, Utah, Davis, or Weber counties, or anyone in Idaho, Wyoming, or Montana back then is eligible to receive compensation for fallout-related cancers.
That was Mary Dixon, a downwinder who you just heard from earlier in the show, and former Utah Representative Ben McAdams talking about extending the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, back in July of 2020. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on funding for downwinders. Joining us now live via Zoom to talk about the issues surrounding RECA is policy analyst Steve Erickson, who has been volunteering for downwinders since 1982. Steve, thanks for your time tonight and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Steve, let's start with our conversation by talking about why you're involved with funding for downwinders. Tell us about that.
Well, I don't consider myself a downwinder. I grew up in Chicagoland and moved to the West in 1974. That said, everyone on the northern hemisphere of the planet has a little piece of the Nevada test site within their bodies, and it's ubiquitous around the planet. I did it because it's a matter of justice and a matter of trying to achieve some peace and sense in the world. So it was more of my attempt to do the right thing.
Now, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, it ends next year. Could you tell us if you feel that the compensation has been adequate? Are medical costs covered, and has the funding grown with inflation?
Well, how do you compensate for the cost of a life lost? I mean, it's a difficult question. We always argued that one way to achieve justice would have been to declare everyone who was exposed and suffered as a result of that exposure a veteran of the Cold War and be eligible for healthcare services under the VA like veterans are. But since that's not how it went, no, $50,000 in a medical sense these days is not even a copay for many. And so it wasn't about the money for many. It was about the justice. It was about the recognition and the acknowledgement by the government that they wronged the people who were harmed by government action. It's been very helpful for people just to get by, but no, it's not been adequate, and it's certainly not kept up with inflation.
Let's go through some of the nuts and bolts of RECA. Who can apply? Where can they apply from, as in which states? What diseases and cancers are included?
Well, there's 19 separate cancers. I won't go through the whole list, but it goes from what you heard earlier, multiple myeloma, thyroid cancer, there's lung cancer, breast cancer, small intestine and colon cancer, esophagus, pharynx. There's a long list. You have to have an ability to prove that you have both had those eligible illnesses and that you lived in the counties that were included in the original act and the expanded act in 2000 during the time of testing between 1951 and 1962. There's also another part of the RECA Act which covers uranium workers, uranium miners, millers, transporters, and those that involves 12 separate states. The states that have downwinder eligibility are only parts of Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. But the other the uranium workers, industry workers, covers a lot larger portion, and their eligibility goes with the same cancers basically, and ends in 1971 when there were additional safety protocols put in place for industry workers.
Now, the Utah legislature just introduced a resolution to extend RECA. What does that mean to you, and what do you hope for Utah's federal delegation?
Well, what we're trying to do is to have the Utah legislature and the governor concurring to send a message to our congressional delegation. By the way, that resolution passed its first hurdle unanimously in the House Human Services Committee this morning. The idea is here, let's get our delegation on board. We're going to need the votes of our delegation, in particular Senators Romney and Lee. So we're hoping that people will contact our U.S. senators and encourage them to join in this effort to extend and expand RECA.
Steve, we have about 30 seconds left. I'd like to get your final thoughts, final words, anything else you'd like to include that we haven't included in this discussion?
Well, I particularly want to thank Jim Matheson for his reminding people that this isn't a done project. We have a lot of issues with what's going on in the world today and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the efforts by our government to increase pit production for nuclear weapons, for new missiles which are being constructed now, will be built in northern Utah. So this isn't over, and we will be seeing a lot more of these kinds of efforts to expand our nuclear arsenal, and that is counterproductive and puts everyone else at risk. So it's not just about the past, it's about the future, and it's about protecting people from this ever happening again.
All right, you've been hearing from policy analyst Steve Erickson. Steve, thank you so much for making the time to be part of our conversation tonight. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.